The silence between two hearts. It was one of those golden evenings in Lowe's Angels, where the sky turned from coral to rose and the breeze carried memories instead of wind. The world outside was noisy as always, cars moving in a rhythm only the city understood, tourists chasing stars on the sidewalk, and music leaking from restaurants lit with dreams. But inside Keanu Reeves' quiet home in the Hollywood Hills, there was only the sound of two coffee mugs clicking softly against a wooden table. No cameras, no scripts, no crew. Just him and her, Sandra Bullock. They were older now. Not old, but aged like the kind of wine no one dares to open unless the moment is sacred. Their laughter had faded into smiles and their past flirtations into a silence deeper than words. Yet somehow the silence said everything. Keanu sat with his signature stillness, dressed in soft grays, barefoot on the hardwood floor. Sandra, wrapped in a sweater 3 sizes too big for her, cupped her hands around the warmth of the mug like she was holding onto something fragile. Perhaps she was. They hadn't spoken about it, not in the way people are supposed to talk, not in structured sentences or rehearsed goodbyes, but they both knew. There was an ending coming, not the dramatic kind with slammed doors or final kisses. This was quieter, like watching someone walk away through fog, fading but never vanishing. He had always been like that, quiet in love, loud in loyalty. And she had always been the spark, the laughter in the room, the hurricane that knew when to become a breeze. Their connection wasn't just history, it was chemistry wrapped in restraint. They had filmed some of the most iconic scenes in cinema together, but the most unforgettable moments between them were never captured on camera. Like the time he showed up with flowers on her birthday every year, even if they were in different cities. Or the day she sent him a painting she made of a lake because it reminded her of the stillness in his soul. No headlines, no gossip. Just the kind of bond that didn't ask for attention, only respect. That evening, Keanu looked at her like a man memorizing something he didn't want to forget. Not her face, that would stay with him forever, but the way her eyes held stars when she smiled, the curve of her laugh, the way she always reached for his hand when she was scared, even during press conferences. Sandra, for her part, wasn't ready to let go either, but she had known him long enough to read the shifts in his energy. He was preparing to walk away, not from her, but from the idea of them. Something had changed. He had been pulling away gently, like a tide receding from the shore, leaving behind shells of all the things unsaid. And in her heart, Sandra knew sometimes love doesn't end because it's broken. Sometimes it ends because it's too whole to be contained. He finally spoke, his voice as soft as mist. "I've been thinking," he began, eyes not meeting hers, "about where I am in life, about what I've done and what I've avoided." Sandra didn't interrupt. She knew better than to disturb a heart unraveling itself. "I've loved you," he continued, "in every way I knew how, even when I couldn't say it, even when it wasn't right." She blinked once. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, but she didn't speak, not yet. He looked up, and for a second, his eyes shimmered with a truth too big for words. "But maybe it's time I stop holding on to something I only had in half measures. You deserve someone who runs toward you, not someone who waits in shadows." And just like that, the quiet goodbye began, not with a kiss, not with a fight, but with reverence. Sandra set down her mug slowly, walked over to him, and placed her hand gently on his cheek. "I've loved you in silence too, Keanu," she whispered, "but maybe we were always meant to be each other's almosts." They didn't cry. They didn't beg. They didn't promise to keep in touch, because sometimes the most beautiful endings are the ones that respect the story rather than trying to rewrite it. She left that night just as the sun dipped below the hills, her silhouette framed in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, as if the universe paused to memorize it. And when the door clicked shut behind her, Keanu closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to cry, but to feel the ache of goodbye that only comes when you've finally told the truth. A goodbye not of regret, but of gratitude, because some people don't stay in your life forever, they stay in your soul. And Sandra Bullock would stay in his soul until the last breath of his silence. The days that followed moved like slow rivers, silent, steady, and full of invisible currents. Keanu Reeves wasn't a man known for unraveling in public or bearing his wounds like open skies. He had always been composed, carved from quiet, a man of layers buried deep beneath still waters. But that morning, after Sandra closed the door and didn't return, something in him shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no broken glasses, just a new weight in the air that couldn't be seen, only felt. His home, once a haven of calm, now echoed with the absence of footsteps that had never stayed long, but it always felt like they belonged. The coffee mugs from the night before still sat on the table, her sweater still draped over the back of a chair, as if her presence hadn't fully left, only paused. Keanu walked through the rooms as if they were memories, not spaces. The kitchen reminded him of mornings when she'd laugh mid-sip of tea, and he'd watch her from behind his newspaper, pretending not to notice the way she filled the room with warmth. The hallway still held the faint scent of her perfume, vanilla and something he could never name. In the corner of the study, there was a painting she once gave him. She hadn't said much when she handed it over, just smiled and whispered, "It reminded me of you." It was of a lake at dawn, mist rising, soft light kissing the water. Peaceful, isolated, unreachable. He understood it now more than he did then. It wasn't just a gift, it was a mirror. He tried to distract himself with scripts, with books, with his motorcycle rides down the coast, but nothing filled the space she left behind. He wasn't grieving a breakup. There had never been an official us. No tabloids captured their stolen moments, no red carpet posed them together as a couple, but they had shared something far more intimate, a silent understanding, a rhythm that only their hearts knew how to dance to. Losing her wasn't the loss of a lover. It was the slow fading of a song he'd kept humming for decades, a song that only she knew the lyrics to. Meanwhile, Sandra was not doing much better. Across town in her own home, filled with sun and laughter and curated chaos, she was surrounded by everything and still felt the absence of one thing, him. Her assistant noticed she stared at her phone too long. Her director on set noticed she took too many retakes for simple lines. Her son, too young to understand love and loss, noticed she hugged him a little tighter every night. She didn't talk about Keanu, she never had. Not even when he showed up to her father's funeral uninvited, standing at the back like a shadow who knew his place, but refused to let her grieve alone. Not when he sent her handwritten notes during award seasons, always ending with, "Proud of you, always." Not when he built a shelf in her garage because she once mentioned she didn't know how to use a drill. These weren't stories she shared. They were moments she carried like hidden jewelry close to the heart, away from the world. But now that it was over, whatever it was, she felt it like a phantom pain. He hadn't said he'd never speak to her again. There was no final curtain drop, no cruel words, just an invisible closing of a door she hadn't realized they were standing behind. And that's what hurt the most, the tenderness of the goodbye, the kindness in it, because it meant he didn't hate her, didn't blame her. He just knew they had reached the edge of a chapter, and unlike the movies, there was no rewrite. Back in the hills, Keanu found himself standing before the painting once more. He traced the lines with his eyes, as if seeking answers in the colors she once placed there. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up a pen and began writing a letter. Not an email, not a message, a real letter. The kind lovers used to send across oceans. The kind you folded gently and never threw away. His handwriting was clean but slow, as if each word cost him something. He didn't write to change her mind. He wrote because sometimes closure doesn't arrive in conversation. It arrives in the courage to say everything left unsaid. He wrote about their first meeting, how he remembered the way her eyes lit up when the director yelled "cut," and she laughed like the camera had set her free. He wrote about the time they sat in silence for 3 hours, watching the rain on a trailer roof, and how that was the most peaceful he'd ever felt in Hollywood. He wrote about the night she had a panic attack before a premiere, and how holding her hand backstage wasn't a choice, it was instinct. He didn't ask for her back. He didn't ask for a reply. He just said thank you, for being the calm in his storm, the fire in his frost, the memory he never wanted to erase. He sealed the envelope but didn't send it, not yet. He placed it in the drawer next to the mug she used, beside a photo they once took together that never made it to Instagram. He wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be, but the letter existed now. And sometimes the act of expressing love is enough, even if no one ever reads it. The next morning, as the city awoke in its chaotic beauty, Keanu stood on his balcony watching the sunrise. His eyes were tired but at peace. Below, life moved as usual, but inside him, something had quietly shifted. He had said goodbye not to her but to the dream of what they might have been. And in that surrender, he found a strange, beautiful freedom. Because letting go of someone you love isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you'll ever do. The world didn't stop just because two hearts had quietly drifted apart. Hollywood didn't notice. Fans didn't ask. Paparazzi lenses didn't catch the nuance in their eyes during red carpets or the silence in their hugs that used to linger just a second longer. To the public, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were still two legends, still graceful, still kind, still friends. But underneath the practiced smiles and warm professionalism, something had been left behind, something raw and unresolved. Not bitter, not broken, just unspoken. That was the kind of pain that hurt the most. The kind that didn't explode but quietly folded itself into daily life. Months passed like gentle footsteps down a hallway with no end. Keanu busied himself with a new script, a quiet indie film about loss and memory. How poetic. Sandra, meanwhile, was back on set, wearing costumes and faces that weren't hers, hiding the exhaustion of the heart beneath the glow of makeup and the echo of laughter. But it was inevitable in an industry that recycles faces and fates that they would meet again, not on purpose, not even planned. It happened in the green room of a late-night talk show. 2 chairs, 1 hallway, 1 memory colliding with another. The producer hadn't meant for it. Keanu was supposed to be the final guest. Sandra had been bumped earlier due to a segment running long, but the schedule changed and there they were backstage, both waiting, both holding mugs of lukewarm tea that neither wanted. When their eyes met, there wasn't shock, just stillness. He nodded. She smiled. But the silence was no longer comfortable. It was crowded, with what-ifs, with letters unsent, with memories that refused to stay in the past. "You look well," she said first, her voice softer than the buzz of the air conditioner humming nearby. "So do you," he replied, but it wasn't small talk. It was truth. She looked like a woman who had survived something beautiful and terrible, like someone who had loved deeply and lived through the letting go. They sat not beside each other, across, like a chessboard with 2 kings left standing, neither ready to surrender. She glanced at the bouquet of lilies on the table, a gift for the host. He followed her eyes and smiled gently. "Still allergic?" he asked. She nodded, laughing quietly. "Some things don't change." He wanted to say neither do feelings, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded paper. A habit, perhaps. Maybe the same letter from months ago, or a new one. He didn't say. He simply held it in his palm for a second, then tucked it back. She saw it, of course she did. "Is that for me?" she asked, not accusingly, but curiously, like a child who spots a wrapped gift but doesn't want to assume. He paused, then shook his head. "No, not anymore, it was once." Sandra didn't flinch. She nodded, accepting the wound as if it were rain on her skin. "That's okay. I think I would have cried if I read it." "You cried anyway?" he whispered, and she looked up, startled. "Yes," she admitted, "but they were gentle tears." "Good," he said. "You deserve gentle." The green room felt heavier than it should, as if the walls were listening, as if the past was sitting with them, legs crossed, waiting to be acknowledged. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her fingers interlaced. "Why did you never fight for us?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge, it was a release. He sighed, not tired, just old in spirit. Because fighting means forcing, and love, true love, should never have to be forced. It should bloom, not beg. She looked down, her voice trembling like the edge of a violin string. "But I would have met you halfway." "I know," he said, "but I didn't want you to walk alone if I couldn't follow." A knock at the door interrupted the quiet storm between them. "Mr. Reeves, they're ready for you," called a young assistant, clueless to the gravity that had just shattered and floated invisibly across the room. Keanu stood, slow and graceful. She didn't. He looked at her one last time, not like a man looking at an actress or a friend or a former flame, but like a soul saying farewell to its reflection in another. "This time," he said gently, "you don't need to wait for me to come back, because I never really left. A part of me has always been yours." He turned and walked out. Sandra sat there alone, her fingers now pressed against her lips, as if holding in a scream of emotion that would never find words. She wasn't crying, but her soul was, not out of sadness, but out of understanding, because that's the thing about certain kinds of love, they're not meant to be held. They're meant to be felt, once, deeply, and remembered forever. Sandra never expected her birthday to feel like this. The world around her celebrated. Friends posted filtered pictures, her team sent her designer gifts, her manager confirmed a charity gala in her name. Balloons, flowers, perfume, even a custom cake designed to mimic an award she once won. But beneath it all, she felt a haunting absence, an emptiness only one person's presence could have filled. She kept looking at her phone, half expecting a message. Something quiet, something handwritten. Something so uniquely Keanu. For the past 15 years, regardless of where he was, regardless of what they were, Keanu Reeves had always remembered her birthday. Sometimes with extravagant silence, like planting her favorite tree in her backyard without saying a word. Sometimes with humor, like a vintage vinyl of a band they once mocked on a road trip. But this year, there was nothing. And she knew why. This time the distance wasn't accidental. It was sacred. It wasn't caused by misunderstanding, but by deep understanding. A mutual surrender. A respectful goodbye, but knowing why something ended didn't make it hurt any less. The pain simply became wiser, quieter, like a violin note played in a cathedral, echoing, haunting, reverent. The party had too many people, too many loud voices, too many fake laughs that bounced off her smile. She wore the dress she knew she looked great in, but it didn't matter. Her heart wasn't wearing anything glamorous. It was dressed in old memories, curled up on the floor of the past, whispering his name when no one else was listening. When someone asked her to make a wish before blowing out the candles, she closed her eyes longer than needed. Behind those eyes was not a wish, but a memory. Years ago, in a cabin far away from lights and expectations, Keanu had made her birthday feel like poetry. He had no grand plan, no PR-perfect gestures. Just 2 mugs of hot cocoa, a wooden floor, a playlist of songs that reminded them of nothing but each other, and a handwritten note she never showed anyone. It simply said, "You were born," and the world became bearable. She never forgot that. After the party, when the noise was gone and her shoes were off, Sandra walked barefoot into her library, the only room in her home where everything stayed the same. She lit 1 candle, not for drama, but because it made her feel human. She curled up in the armchair, pulled out a book she didn't intend to read, and let herself finally cry, not because he had forgotten her, but because he had remembered her enough to let her go. That kind of love didn't leave scars. It left flowers on the windowsill of her soul. Far across the city, Keanu sat alone in his garage, not working on a motorcycle, not reading, not even drinking tea, just sitting, in the stillness, in the knowing. He had the letter he never gave her folded once again in his hand. He hadn't opened it in weeks, but he knew the words like scripture. He had written them not just for her, but for the man he was when he loved her. And that man still lived inside him, even if quieter now, even if older. He glanced at the date on his phone. October 26, her birthday. His thumb hovered over her name in his contact list. A name he had never renamed. Just Sandra. Not Sandy, not SB, not even a heart emoji, just Sandra. Because she had never needed dressing up. She had always been enough exactly as she was. He didn't call. He didn't text. But he did walk to the drawer, take out a small box wrapped in navy blue paper and place it by the door. Inside it was a necklace, not expensive, not flashy, just a tiny silver compass. Because once, many years ago, she told him she always felt lost, even in crowds, and he had said, "Then I'll be your direction." He wasn't anymore, but the necklace still meant something. The next morning, before dawn broke the silence of the hills, Keanu drove out, parked 3 blocks from her house, walked quietly through a sleeping street, and placed the gift at her gate with a note that said nothing but, "For the moments when you feel lost." Kay. He didn't wait, he didn't look back. And Sandra, waking just before sunrise for no reason she could explain, walked barefoot outside and saw it. She held the box in her hand, her breath trembling, her soul breaking open like a window in a storm. She read the note again and again, even though it barely said anything, because in that silence she heard everything. Sometimes the deepest love stories are not about staying together. They are about showing up in the smallest moments, until the very end. There are moments in life when the past doesn't knock on the door, it just slips inside through the cracks you thought you sealed shut. For Sandra, that moment arrived on a rainy Sunday morning. The sky was soft gray, the kind of color that makes everything feel closer, heavier, more sacred. She wasn't dressed for company, just in an old hoodie and wool socks, a mug of chamomile tea in her hands, the fireplace alive but not loud. She had opened the drawer of an antique desk, looking for a pen to sign charity forms when she found it, a small envelope faded slightly at the edges, addressed in familiar handwriting. Her name. Just her name. No embellishments, no postscript, just Sandra. As if saying her name alone was enough to explain everything. She froze, time didn't, the fireplace still crackled, the kettle still hissed. But she had stopped moving, stopped breathing. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this envelope might contain. She knew instantly who it was from. No one else wrote her name like that, like a prayer, like an apology, like a vow made in silence. Her heart beat so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She didn't open it right away. She sat down, let her fingers run across the paper. Touched the corner where it had been folded with care. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened the letter. Sandra, I've started this letter 100 times, erased lines, rewritten them, tried to make the words feel less heavy. But the truth is they are heavy, because they carry years of things I never said aloud, things I never had the right to say. Her breath hitched. You once asked me why I never fought for us. The truth is, I did. Just not in the ways people expect. I fought by staying near even when I wanted to run. I fought by never crossing a line you weren't ready for. I fought by letting you shine without ever making you feel like you owed me a shadow. A tear slipped down her cheek. It didn't sting, it was warm, familiar. There were so many nights I wanted to call. So many days I wanted to just show up. But I was always afraid I would mess it up, afraid I wasn't enough or too much. You were this beautiful, untamed light, and I was just trying not to burn. She folded the letter halfway, held it to her chest like it might disappear, then unfolded it again. Do you remember that cabin, that birthday? You told me it was the first time you didn't feel like you had to be Sandra Bullock. You were just Sandy, just a woman, barefoot and real, and I remember thinking I could spend forever in this version of us. Quiet, honest, safe. More tears now, not sobbing, just streams. But we never had forever, did we? We had moments, and moments I've learned are their own kind of eternity. I didn't send this letter because I wanted a reply. I'm writing it now because I need you to know I loved you. I never stopped. I never will. And letting you go was not giving up. It was giving in to the truth that loving someone sometimes means not asking them to carry your weight, even if you would have without question. You once told me I was your compass, but Sandra, you've always been my true north. There was no signature, just white space. And in that silence, she felt the weight of everything they had never said, and yet everything that had already been understood. She didn't move for a long time, just sat there with the letter resting on her lap like a sleeping memory. Outside, the rain softened, and inside her something opened, not a wound, but a door she had been too afraid to walk through before, not toward him, but toward herself, the version of herself that loved him in silence and never allowed herself to say it out loud. And far away in a cabin in Big Sur where the waves met the cliffs like old lovers embracing again, Keanu stood looking out the window, holding the carbon copy of the same letter. He had written it twice, once for her, once for himself. And even though he didn't know she'd found it, something told him she had. Because sometimes souls don't need texts. They don't need calls or confirmations. They just feel each other. Even in goodbye. Especially in goodbye. Time has a strange way of softening things. Sharp memories become rounded, pain becomes poetry, and people who once stood at the center of your universe settle quietly into its corners, never gone, just no longer burning. It had been nearly a year since Keanu left the necklace at her gate. A full cycle of seasons, a dozen premieres. 100 interviews where both actors smiled through the questions, waved at fans, took pictures, signed autographs, and returned to homes that no longer had each other in them. But there were places their names still lingered, silent credits at the bottom of dreams, lines carved into the backs of old photographs, stories that never made it into headlines but lived inside the walls of their hearts. Sandra had changed, not outwardly, but inwardly. The woman who once filled every space with sunshine and sarcasm now moved a little slower, laughed a little softer, and listened more, not because she was sad, but because she had finally learned the beauty of stillness. She no longer looked for closure. She carried it. In a drawer in her bedroom was the compass necklace, resting beside the letter she had reread more times than she would ever admit. She never wore it in public. But on quiet nights, when the house was still, and the stars outside blinked like Morse code from the universe, she'd hold it against her chest like a heartbeat that never fully left. And Keanu, he had become something of a myth again, riding through California on his motorcycle, taking uncredited roles in small films, showing up at children's hospitals with no PR team, leaving quietly before anyone could take a photo. He had always been elusive, but now he was something more, peaceful, as if he had finally made peace with the pieces he couldn't keep. He hadn't fallen in love again, not in the way people expect. But he had fallen into something gentler, writing, painting, rescuing stray dogs from shelters. He no longer chased anything, not even healing. He just lived. And then came the moment no one saw coming. It was at a tribute event, a celebration of the great romances of cinema. One of those black tie affairs where they honored classic films and the chemistry that lit up screens. Of course, Speed was mentioned, and the lake house. And of course, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves were invited to present. Not together, but fate, perhaps tired of waiting, stepped in. He arrived first. Calm, grounded in a simple black suit with no tie. She arrived later, radiant in a deep emerald gown that made the room hush when she entered. The organizers, unaware of the gravity between them, placed them at adjacent seats. The audience watched with curiosity. The cameras zoomed in, but nothing seemed unusual. No drama, no tension, just a quiet comfort between two people who had already said everything without needing to speak. Then came the moment. They were called on stage together to present a clip from their most iconic film. The applause thundered. The lights softened. They stood side by side once more, not characters, not celebrities, but souls whose paths had once intertwined so tightly they could never fully untangle. As the montage played behind them, scenes of their younger selves ran across the giant screen, holding hands, running from explosions, kissing through time, whispering lines written by others but spoken from real feeling. The crowd laughed, some cried, but Sandra, she just glanced sideways at him. And he, for a moment, let his eyes rest on her profile, not the actress, not the icon, but the woman he once loved in silence. When the lights returned, it was Keanu who spoke first, unscripted. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the most beautiful scenes are the ones that happen when the camera stops rolling." Sandra looked at him, her throat tightening. "And some of the best love stories," she added without missing a beat, "don't end with a kiss, they end with gratitude." The crowd clapped, but the two of them stood still for a breath longer than necessary, sharing one last invisible moment, one final chapter written not with ink but with peace. That night when Sandra returned home, she placed her heels beside the compass necklace, not in sadness, but in closure. And miles away, Keanu rode into the night, the wind in his hair, the sky above him endless. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because some goodbyes don't hurt. Some goodbyes are gentle. Some goodbyes are, in their own quiet way, love's most honest form. And this was their final scene, never filmed but forever felt.